Today we're going to talk about how to plan your learning segment. One of the first things that we learn about the edTPA is that we have to um, plan a learning segment that's going to be recorded. And this is the way that we get our planning and our instruction. And then we have to plan for assessment as well. So today we're going to take a look at what is involved in planning your learning segment. Okay, sorry about that. So, just like any type of good planning, you should use a backward design approach when planning the edTPA. We have task 1, 2, and 3, and I wish actually that they didn't use numbers, because the numbers make you think step 1, 2, and 3. And that's not exactly, so the edTPA is not linear, because teaching is not linear. If you've been in the classroom, you know teaching is about as messy as you can get. Teaching and learning is very messy. We plan in order to try to streamline things, but all of that planning and instructing and assessment is generally going on all at one time. So one of the things that you need to do is that you have to look at the other 2 tasks before you start task 1. So you need to open your handbook and read task 3, and you need to read task 2 before beginning on task 1. So this is very important. The task 2 is your instruction, and as you're reading that, you need to take a close look at what kind of video evidence you're going to need. Are you going to need evidence of small group instruction, student engagement, academic language? What all are you going to need to get on video? You need to know about that before you plan your lessons. Also, you need to be thinking about your assessment. In backward design approach, I would recommend creating the assessment at the beginning. And that way, everything is aligned, all of your objectives and your instructional procedures. So you're going to be thinking about the evidence that you need for your assessment task 3, and you need to be thinking about the evidence you need for your video. How do I select the central focus, the student content standards, and the student learning objectives? Well, the central focus is really not so much of a big a deal. I think it's because it's the first term that a lot of students see that they're not immediately familiar with, and so because of that, they kind of get a little confused by it. But a central focus just means, what is it you're teaching in this learning segment? So it could be a theme, it could be an essential question, it might just be a topic. You might write out the purpose of the instruction for the learning segment. So don't get bogged down with getting, with this definition of central focus. But once you've decided what you're teaching, you describe what you're teaching, and that's your central focus. And you should be teaching from standards. So you need to make sure that you've got your standards, you've got your learning objectives, your task and assessments, all along with that central focus. And I just want to say really clearly, for those of you who are at my university, you do not do the 18 rubric elementary education edTPA. You do the 15 rubric, either the elementary math or the elementary literacy. So we're not talking about finding science standards or social studies standards. You need to find literacy standards or math standards, and that's what you'll write your edTPA on. The rest of you need to make sure that you're writing your edTPA, of course, based on whatever handbook you're in. If you're teaching a grade 7 using the grade 7-12 social studies handbook, then you don't want to teach a class that's not social studies. It needs to be one that is social studies. You would think these things are obvious, but they're not. I've heard all kinds of questions. Um, so when you are thinking about your central focus, you want to make it broad because you're not wanting to just teach the skills or the facts or the procedures, these lower order thinking. That's not going to get you very far on the edTPA. So, for example, those of you who teach English, you should steer away from grammar. Because there's not a lot that you've got to work with there. If you're teaching math, you're going to want to make sure that you're teaching the concepts and the mathematical reasoning, not just the skills. So this is an important thing. You want a central focus that's broad enough to where we're going to be working with lower order thinking often, but we're really going to focus on that higher order thinking. if your focus only teaches facts and doesn't work on understanding related concepts, then you're not going to do well on this assessment. So you will need in your lesson plans to make sure that you identify what standard you're using. And you should get your standard from your mentor. It needs to be a state, national, or a locally adopted standard. And it's, of course, relevant to your context. So if you're teaching English, you're not going to have a math standard. And again, if you were teaching a history class, you wouldn't pull out an English standard. And these things, you have to make sure that you understand what it is you're teaching, and the standard does fit with that. So you might find several standards that fit what you're teaching. But you don't want to be writing about several standards, and you want your instruction to be more focused than that. So it is a very good advice that you use only a few standards that you're going to be focusing on in instruction. Use only the standards that are central to the student learning, that you expect to support and document in your edTPA. So if it's prior skills and knowledge, that's of course going to be part of your lesson or your learning segment if you need it, but it's not the standard that you're focusing on. Okay. The amount of content that you address. This is very important because you want to make sure that it's manageable. You have 3 to 5 lessons, consecutive lessons, lessons that do not occur on the same day. Again, that has to be said. So we're talking about Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, or if you see your students every day, if you see your students every day, it would be Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, and possibly Thursday, Friday. If you see them once a week, then it's going to be over a period of 3 weeks. But it's very important that you keep in mind how much time you've got with your students and what you're going to be able to teach them in that length of time. So it's not like, so this learning segment has to go from beginning to end, and you're just not taking a slice out. So there's got to be a logical beginning of the segment, a logical ending. So you want to build on your central focus and the corresponding standards. You want to make sure it's manageable in that length of time. So what should you include in your lesson plans? I know at ETSU we've got lengthy plans, and those are excellent for you in preparation for the edTPA. With the actual edTPA document, you will submit lesson plans that are no more than 4 pages in length each. So if you have 3 plans, then you'll have 12 pages of lesson plans. With this particular artifact, you can fiddle with the font some. However, keep in mind that oftentimes your scorers are people who are my age, and we want our scorers to be able to read our artifacts. So you need to provide enough detail so that the educator that's reading your edTPA can understand the sequence of your plans, understand the objectives and how you're going to assess and what you're going to have students do. You want to make sure these are the must-haves. Your lesson plans must have standards within your teaching context. You must have learning objectives, not performance objectives. You need to have learning objectives associated with those standards. Formal and informal assessments. Those must be identified on your lesson plans. And there's been a lot of conversation about whether or not you should talk about formative and summative. I'm telling you, no one is really interested in formative and summative. That is because summatives are large and often come at the end of a unit, and we're only looking at a slice of that. The learning segment is so small, there might not be a summative at the end of that. So we're talking about formal assessments and informal assessments. If you've forgotten the difference in those, I do have a video on that on my channel, so make sure you take a look at that. You want instructional and learning tasks and the resources and materials that you're going to use. Now on our on our ETSU template, we've got a place for rationale, and you're doing that in your classes, and that's great practice for you. However, we will not have rationale or explanations such as knowing your learners. That does not and should not be on your lesson plans for the edTPA submission. All of that sort of thing needs to be in your commentary because in this particular task, the lesson plans are supportive documentation. The primary source of evidence will come from the commentary. This is a great tool here that you can use to plan your learning segment. You come up with your central focus, you put your state adopted content standards, and you start thinking about your lessons. What are going to be your learning objectives for each lesson? What strategies will you use for those learning tasks? How will you informally assess? And how will you formally assess? Talking about elementary literacy in particular, don't even think about planning anything until you have chosen an essential literacy strategy. I know a common problem with elementary folks is that they go and they talk to their mentor about needing a central focus to teach on, and their mentor tries to be helpful by handing them, for example, like a packet on space or the life cycle of a butterfly. Unfortunately, you don't teach those things for the edTPA. All of your rubrics are either going to be based on an essential literacy strategy or they're going to be based on your mathematical SSE. So you need to go to your understanding rubric level progressions document, literacy folks. You must look at that. Now, you know I call it the Earl Because who wants to say understanding rubric level progressions over and over again all their life? Not me. So I call it Earl, and plus it's more fun. So you need to look at that document, turn to page 47, and you'll see all of these literacy strategies, the related skills, and so this is like your thinking organizer. This would be a great thing to sit down and just jot down ideas. So, a minute ago when I was telling you about the Earl and the literacy, this is what it looks like. It's in Appendix A, and I felt so stupid because I actually had taught seminar with edTPA folks more time than I'd like to admit before I realized this was in the back of the elementary literacy Earl. But in the back of it, you can see that you've got your essential literacy strategies here and your related skills here. And it goes on for several pages looking like this. Again, your central literacy strategies are on the left, related skills are on the right. There's actually 3 or 4 more pages, but at the end, here's where they talk about examples of activities that promote reading and writing connections, because they do talk about that in your prompt. You do have to write about reading and writing connections. Let's take a look at the math. This is something you can use to sketch out your elementary math. Also, secondary ed math. This is you too. You should be recognizing these as your SSE, your subject-specific emphasis. So start with your central focus. And these are not lesson 1, lesson 2, lesson 3. These are how in your learning segment. How in the learning segment are you going to address conceptual understanding? How in your learning segment are you going to address procedural fluency? In your learning segment, how will you address mathematical reasoning or problem solving? These things do not need to be in every lesson, but they all must appear in your learning segment. So be thinking about that. What learning objective could reflect that conceptual understanding? What activities could support that? How could you assess it? Because these are all critical things that you will need to do in planning for a math edTPA. This is one for literacy. Oh, sorry. So, I'm sorry, not literacy. This is one for secondary ed. And everybody in secondary education has their own SSE. And if you want to find out what your SSE is, you can look on page 1 for most of you, page 1 or 2 of your handbook. When it gives this overview of the assessment, it's generally in this paragraph right here. Other than that, it's almost always a bulleted list in planning, the rubric 1. So this rubric 1 has got it listed for everybody. So this is Tech Ed, and there's their SSC. So let's go back here. So let's say Tech Ed has, he has one, or that person who I'm thinking about is a he, that has 1, 2, 3 SSE in his in his handbook. And so 1, 2, 3. So that first one was, I think, technical skills, conceptual understanding, engineering design, and problem solving. So he would put technical skills, engineering design, and whatever that third one was. I know it was problem solving, but anyway. So then on that first SSE, what objective in the segment could reflect that, and what activities, and how would you assess it? So this is the one for anybody in secondary ed. This is what they can use. And if you don't know what your SSE is, this is something I suggest you find out like yesterday. The sooner you find out about your SSE and get comfortable in knowing what your SSE is, the better. Then this document here is another way to organize your learning segment. So describe in more detail now your central focus of the learning segment, your curriculum standards, what are they? And now let's think about lesson one. Lesson one, what objectives? And which of these SSE are assessed or practiced with these objectives? And same thing, lesson two, you think about your methods and your activities, your informal and formal assessments. Every content area has these SSEs, these subject-specific emphasis, and I have another presentation on that, subject-specific emphasis. And it's very important that you reflect on these content areas. It's really important, and that they be reflected in your objectives and in your activity, and that you are also assessing them. And a final organizer, again, this is one I've had students use, excuse me, and they really liked it. So here's your objectives and your standards. How are you going to assess it? So you're going to write out your formal and informal. At this point, you've got some copying and pasting that you can do. We've got to add in criteria for performance, otherwise known as evaluation criteria. So we know how we're going to assess it. How are we going to know if the students did well? What's our evaluation criteria for these assessments? What kind of learning tasks are we going to develop? What kind of learning tasks are we going to give the students to help them develop these performance criteria? And how are you going to, what supports will you use? Can't tell you any better than what the last person that I worked with individually with, she told me, she said, once you've got this done, you've got your segment planned. And she's exactly right. This is a very good document and very helpful. So, when you are looking at your lesson plan template, you'll want to go through and complete all of the things that are necessary. When you're finished, after you have completed your lesson plan, then I would go through and remove all of these italics, because the italics do not help. They're not necessary. They're there to guide you, but they're not needed for the edTPA. So anything that's in there that's italics, take those out and just leave the things that are in regular script. So thank you very much for joining me today, and I hope that you will take the time to have a good conversation with your mentor about what you can plan and teach for the edTPA that's coming up. It is a lengthy thing to go through this learning segment, but the first step is finding out what the segment needs to be on. One more thing. Oftentimes, people will say, well, I don't know what I'm going to be teaching in January and February. If I had $1 for every time I heard that, then I wouldn't still be here. I would be, I would probably be in Tahiti with somebody bringing me little tiki drinks or whatever they're called. I don't even know what that lifestyle's like. So, not ever being a woman of leisure, I have no idea. But I do know that this question has been asked repeatedly. So, what to do? Well, okay, let's say your mentor does not know what she's going to teach in January or February. She needs to make a guess. If she can't, possibly we need to put you in a new placement because you can't graduate without the edTPA. Okay, so we need cooperation with your mentor. That's important. If you wait until January to write this task one, then you're going to try to stick about 6 weeks worth of work into 1 week, and that's not going to be very helpful to you. So, what I'd like for you to do is to pin your mentor down and say, well, give me a good guess. And just like anything, the first time you write it, it's going to take you a long time. And the first task does take people a long time to write. But once you've written it, it's just a matter of oftentimes just changing chunks of it to where it will work. So let's not get bogged down with, oh my gosh, I don't know what we're doing. How can we see that far in the future? Well, we're going to take a best guess. Remember what I said? Teaching's messy. Have a good day.